Welcome to Apple Teeny, where today it's AI slop, cursed gadgets, and baffling Apple decisions. A celebrity phone that looks like a markup with a logo, an app store getting buried in AI boilerplate, and Apple somehow making TestFlight harder to use. It's one of those weeks where technology feels less like innovation and more like somebody dared the product team to ship it anyway. The Trump T1 phone story is kind of perfect because it sounds flashy until you look at it for 5 seconds. What you apparently had was basically a rebranded HTC U24 Pro selling for around $500, which is roughly a $100 premium for the privilege of branding. And phones are not hats or steaks or bottles of water. You don't just slap a famous name on one and magically become a hardware company. A phone means supply chain, carrier deals, support, logistics, actual engineering, and demand that lasts longer than a headline. The pre-orders reportedly were limited enough that even those deposits probably didn't cover low-volume production costs anyway. Then you get Trump Mobile itself, which is a branded sub-provider riding on Liberty Mobile, which uses T-Mobile spectrum, and the whole thing starts to look less like telecom ambition and more like brand extraction. The staffing overlaps people noticed. Don't exactly scream deep wireless expertise either. And that's why this lands in the same mental folder as celebrity crypto nonsense, where the brand is the product and everybody else is left holding the bag. The Trump-related crypto numbers were brutal, about $1.8 billion raised while investors collectively lost around $2.8 billion, with promoters keeping a big share. Same basic pattern, different wrapper, famous name, thin substance, expensive lesson. Meanwhile, the App Store is getting absolutely carpet-bombed with AI apps. New app submissions were up about 30% year over year, topping 1 million releases in 2026, while downloads grew only about 2%. That is a giant blinking sign that says oversupply, or, more bluntly, slop. A lot of these apps have the same generic design, the same vague, private and secure copy, a Gmail address for the publisher, and then they vanish after one release. So now, app development is starting to look like content creation, where people crank out one disposable thing and move on, instead of maintaining software like adults. Apple is probably going to have to police this, because abandonware at App Store scale gets ugly fast. And if you're building something real, the lesson is pretty simple. The launch is not the business. Updates, iteration, and building an audience still matter. There is a much more interesting AI story here, and it's the one where AI is useful without pretending it's magic. Overcast has been using a model called Fable to identify and patch weird audio glitches, race conditions, and storage bugs that would otherwise eat a ton of time. That sounds great because it is great, with one very important footnote. AI-generated fixes can also create brand new bugs, so you still need a human looking at the work and making the final call. That's the version of AI-assisted development that makes sense to me. Speed up the miserable bug hunt, don't fire the engineer. Then there's Hermes Agent and the Open Minis work, which is wild in a different way. The idea is that an agent can observe repeated user behavior, turn that into reusable skills, and prune what doesn't matter. Open Minis pushes that further by mapping Apple frameworks like HomeKit, Reminders, and Media to command-line tools, then bundling a Linux shell inside iOS with local Python, Git, and SSH. So instead of AI agent meaning a demo video with dramatic music, it starts meaning practical on-device orchestration of prompts, tools, and memory. That's a lot nerdier and, honestly, a lot more convincing. On the quality side, 2 stories rhyme in a very annoying way. Apple updated TestFlight so beta listings sort alphabetically, instead of by newest version, and it also removed the expired betas heading. So now, active and expired builds get mixed together, and testers have to go scavenger hunting for the current one. Incredible downgrade. Feels exactly like a feature decision that became a bug in real life. Then OpenAI's native macOS ChatGPT app launch had naming confusion, duplicate apps, and update failures. And that felt like the classic product-first rapid release move where platform-specific QA gets treated as optional until users start tripping over it. Different companies, same trade-off, move fast, stay platform agnostic, and then act surprised when the experience turns into mush. A couple of small infrastructure stories were weirdly satisfying. One rack power outage got traced to a failed automatic transfer switch, basically a roughly $1,000 cyber power box that just did not flip between feeds when it needed to and sat there blinking like it was thinking about it. That ended with a replacement and a temporary loaner from the data center, which is the least glamorous kind of drama but very real. There was also a long-distance Ethernet run across 5 floors with a 10 gig upstream over fiber, but internal networking still capped at 2.5 gig because the rest of the equipment couldn't keep up. Which is such a perfect real-world networking story. The brochure says 10 gig, your actual bottleneck says relax. And on the home audio side, Sonos finally added an option to disable SonosNet. That matters, because SonosNet could fight with third-party routers like Ubiquiti, and even trigger spanning tree crashes in mixed wired and wireless setups. Disable it, stability comes back, surround pairs behave, and everybody gets reminded that old networking workarounds do eventually expire. Apple had a very Apple set of side plots this week. The game porting toolkit means PC games can technically make the jump to macOS, but the audience is still small enough that a lot of developers just don't see the return. So yes, the tech exists, the business case is still squinting at the spreadsheet. People are also floating the idea that Apple could turn Apple TV into a cheap little console with an M-series chip and active cooling. Maybe, but if the box is already hovering around $200 to $250, and there's no truly compelling dedicated storefront strategy, that's not exactly an easy win. Apple also raised service prices again, and the dollar amounts look small until you notice the percentage jumps. Apple Music Individual went from $11 to $12 a month, Family from $17 to $20, and Apple One Premier from $30 to $40. That's the subscription trick in a nutshell. A modest bump on paper, a very noticeable one when it hits the monthly budget. One of the funniest contrast stories here is physical media. Sony says it'll stop shipping PlayStation discs after 2028 and go fully digital, which also means goodbye to the resale market that used to keep game prices a little more honest. At the exact same time, US CD sales were reportedly up 16% year-over-year in the first half of 2026, thanks in part to nostalgia and K-pop. So physical media is both dying and having a boutique comeback, depending on whether the thing can be collectible, giftable, or fandom-coded enough. Which honestly makes sense. People don't always want the most efficient format, sometimes they want the object. A few smaller stories were just plain charming. There was a custom tooltip system built to avoid the browser's delayed title tooltips, specifically so enlarged emoji tiles could show Apple icon names instantly. Tiny fix, huge quality of life energy. A homemade vibe-coded video trimmer, on the other hand, blew up on variable bitrate media and produced audio and video lengths that didn't match, including one cut where the video ended about 15 minutes before the audio. Nightmare stuff. So the switch was to lossless cut for reliable trimming, which is a deeply relatable software arc. Build the fun tool, discover the evil edge case, use the boring tool that works. And I love the 3D printing examples too, from TPU medical device connectors to ASA QR code badges, flagpole mounts, and a custom bracket for a cracked bar foot. That is the best version of desktop fabrication. Not hype, just this part broke. I made one, problem solved. A few fast ones. FileMaker keeps hanging around because for internal small business tools, low code plus offline support plus decent scale is still a real combo, even if the UI feels dated and the licensing and security questions scare off new projects. The EU battery rules, exempting smartwatches and AirPods, make technical sense if you care about size, waterproofing, and not turning everything into a chunkier, failure-prone brick. But it also shows how messy one-size-fits-all repair regulation gets. The macOS Squircle icon fight continues, with one side saying it creates visual consistency and stops giant attention-seeking icons, and the other side saying it flattens app identity into tasteful mush. And the rumored cancelled Apple chip prototypes like M2 Extreme, M3 Extreme, and an M3 Ultra Mac Pro are a reminder that Apple's roadmap probably contains all kinds of expensive fever dreams that die the second the economics look bad. Also, AI demand is pushing up RAM prices and squeezing hardware supply, which feels like the least surprising consequence of everybody deciding local models should live on every machine all at once. And Samsung's Z Fold 8 Ultra sounds genuinely ambitious with the anti-reflective titanium-backed display work, but the naming shuffle around the Fold 7 and Fold 8 is so confusing it feels like a prank by marketing. That's it for Appletini. If you got one thing out of today, maybe let it be this. Branding is not engineering, AI is not quality control, and sometimes the hero is just the boring tool that actually works. See you next time. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.